Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Jay Lloyd. I'm with Issues in Science and Technology, a quarterly journal that's a partnership between the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine and Arizona State University. Today's discussion is being hosted by Issues, along with ASU's Consortium for Science Policy and Outcomes, or CSPO. And I'm really happy to introduce today's discussion, how do you make a policy idea go viral? But before I introduce the moderator, I want to say a bit about our general goal for these events. In part, we want to bring really interesting people with expertise in specialized topics to reflect on the way science, technology, policy, and society interact in the real world. Such a discussion requires not only experts, but lots of other people. In other words, everyone here on Zoom is an important part of this conversation. So about half of today's event will be a moderated discussion between the panelists, and the other half will be the panel engaging with the questions that you ask and the issues you feel are interesting and important. So to enter your questions, use the Q&A function. It's down at the bottom of the screen here. You can use the chat function to talk amongst yourselves, but please use the Q&A to communicate with the moderator so she can see your questions. So let's get started. Our moderator is Editor-in-Chief Lisa Marginelli. I'll turn it over to Lisa to get this underway. Thanks very much for joining us. We really appreciate it, and we're looking forward to the event.
Hello, I'm really happy that you could join us. I'm also super excited to be here. And I want to introduce the other two panelists. The topic today, of course, is how do you make a policy idea go viral? And that's a pretty big question. So we have two people who actually managed to do it. And Caleb Watney is previously Director of Innovation Policy at the Progressive Policy Institute. He's now an independent science and technology policy analyst. And DIVYANSH KAUSHIK is a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon University studying artificial intelligence. He is also the president of the Carnegie Mellon University Graduate Student Assembly. Welcome, Caleb and DIVYANSH.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. That's nice to be here.
Yes, I'm so excited. Before we get started, I just want to say, Issues publishes op-eds and science and technology opinion pieces probably 4 days a week. But what you did when you brought us your piece about rethinking visas for foreign graduate students and startup people and technologists coming to the United States. What you did when yours was published was really kind of totally blew us out of the water. For one thing, the day it was published, Caleb was on Marketplace. So he was on like every major NPR market in the country talking about the idea. And then you were retweeted by the President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration, someone from the Director of Federal Policy for Forward US did it. And then lo and behold, a couple days later, it gets entered into the congressional record by Representative Zoe Lofgren, which was, totally amazing and sort of the goal with these types of things. So I want to just back up and ask you, when did you first start writing this piece? I think I first saw it in early May, but when did you first start writing it, and what were you hoping to do? What was your motivation?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I'll just kick us off. I think this has been a topic that's obviously something that I think both DIVYANSH and I have written about before in different op-eds, but also just online. We're both very active on Twitter, and actually that's how we first met each other, which was fun. I think we started DMing, and DIVYANSH suggested this might be a fruitful topic for us to collaborate on. And so I think he actually reached out to me and suggested that issues might be a good place, and that this all the recent energy around the Endless Frontier Act would be a good opportunity to make the case again for the importance of high-skilled immigration, and just sort of pointing out to people how broken the current system is and the many ways in which we can make it better.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, like last year, Chuck Schumer gave a big speech about when Endless Frontier Act was first introduced. He or before Endless Frontier Act was first introduced, he gave a big speech about how he wants to put in $100 billion into science funding. And he also, during the same speech, he talked about how he wants to pair immigration reform with that funding. And when we saw like Endless Frontier finally being introduced and this piece missing out, it was, well, somebody needs to talk about that, because we're talking a lot about the resources, but we're not talking about the human capital that needs to be brought into the process. And that's how Caleb and I connected. And
So the two of you got together, and how did you start writing an op-ed? Did you use Google Docs?
I think I had started a very rough first draft based off of Caleb's previous piece in the New Atlantis, the Egghead Gap. I was like, okay, there are some pieces here that you could expand upon in an op-ed that's specifically related to science funding and how immigration plays a crucial role alongside that. But there are also other aspects of, because a lot of people were taking one of our Bush's name, or chanting the name, as I like to say. But they were missing out on some key aspects of his report, where he was specifically talking about how the government should take an active role in promoting international flow of scientific information, etc. And so, I wrote a very rough first draft, sent it out to Caleb. Then we got on a call, figured out what we want to do. It sounds nice. We should really write about it. Someone has to write about it. And around that time, we heard about the issues, new series coming up. We're like, okay, that sounds like a nice place to send this. That's how we reached out to you.
Okay.
I guess I would just jump in and quickly add that I think I was super impressed by the initiative that DIVYANSH showed. Like, it's not common that I have, especially students reaching out, just saying like, hey, I want to get involved in policy discussions. Usually it's just like the same crew of characters that are writing about these things in the same kind of journals. And so, I was sort of very intrigued when he first reached out, and I was like, oh, this is interesting. This is not the kind of like initiative that I usually see. And so, I was sort of excited to work on it. I thought it was like a new outlet that I hadn't written for issues before, but obviously I've been reading a lot of your guys' stuff for a long time. And a new co-author as well.
Okay, and did you come at this also from a firsthand perspective, either of you? Had you worked in immigration reform before at all, or did you have some background in it?
Too much. Well, so in my role at Carnegie Mellon Graduate Student Assembly, we advocate for all grad students at CMU in their personal, public, and professional lives. So the Trump administration was definitely, let's just say, not friendly on a lot of issues. And we found ourselves like fighting back on a lot of policies. It got pretty intense last year. In May, there was the H-1B ban, the green card ban, then there were talks of suspending OPT when we.
What is that? Tell us.
The optional practical training program that's available to international students to work in the US for a year or 3 years after graduation. So that's when we formed a coalition of about student governments at 72 universities who wrote to the president, urging him to not do that. And fortunately, OPT was saved at the time. But then just a month later, there was the ICE policy around deporting international students who would not take classes in person, where we filed an amicus brief in the District Court of Massachusetts. So like being involved in this issue for a while, working with members of Congress for them to write letters, like when the ICE policy was introduced, I reached out to Mark Pacan's office, can you help us out? So Representative Mark Pacan was at the time co-chair of the Progressive Caucus. He represents Madison, Wisconsin. And then Representative Debbie Dingell represents Ann Arbor, Michigan. So they represent two big universities. So we reached out to them. I'd worked with Congressman Pakan's legislative director before, and I just asked her, like, is this something you can get your boss to start a letter on, circulate, and we're happy to reach out to other offices, get them to sign on. We organized a bunch of call Congress days around then to get members to sign on to those letters. So it ended up like pretty, like there was a lot of pressure on the executive agencies at that time from Congress because of all these efforts. So that was kind of my experience from my role. But before that, during the election, actually, after that, during the election, a local Pittsburgh news outlet, nonprofit news outlet, Public Source, reached out for like, would you mind writing a first person essay on this? And I was like, sure, why not? And that was actually the first time I wrote about this issue. And I think that got a lot of traction. I got an email from Congressman Mike Doyle, who represents Pittsburgh, and a bunch of other people who were like, I just read it organically and really liked it. So that's how I first realized, well, how much impact you could make if you write about these things in clear, concise terms, presenting both the personal side as well as the bigger picture. Yeah, so that's been my experience. I'm sure Caleb has more to offer.
No, I think one thing that's really important here is that you take your personal experience and you gradually transform it into something that's a tool of interacting with policymakers. So it's a mixture of the argument and the personal experience and the passion for it that makes the argument, convincing. Because otherwise you can do other things with your time than sit around and write op-eds, right? You have to have this sort of like interest and passion and sort of commitment to it. And Caleb, what were you going to add?
I'm just going to say, thankfully, I've had many fewer personal interactions with this very broken system, but it is something that I've been actively writing about and researching for the last couple of years. In particular, in, I think, February earlier this year, I wrote a big report on the International Entrepreneur Rule, which is sort of this parole status that was introduced at the very tail end of the Obama administration that was trying to create de facto a startup visa. Unlike many other Western industrialized countries, the United States does not have a legal path for entrepreneurs specifically to come into the United States, especially ones who are not independently wealthy. And so, this little known parole rule was introduced and then almost immediately put on ice by the Trump administration. So basically the paper was going through and looking at the promise of the rule, what it could potentially offer in terms of a job creation standpoint, dynamism in the U.S. economy, and sort of what could we do tangibly to get the rule back up and running. And so, those are sort of some of the issues that I think made me very excited to then put this within the context of the new push for science funding.
Great. So you came up with like a 1,200 word piece and you got somebody we both knew to send it to me. Why did you do that? Why didn't you just send it directly?
Oh, yeah, good question. I guess I just wasn't sure of how the process worked. But also, I think Sarah reached out to us first, asking like, okay, I know you're working on this piece. I can try and, connect you to the relevant people at Issues who are working on a similar series. Like, okay, yeah, that sounds like an amazing opportunity.
Okay. That's enough. And Sarah is this wonderful connector. Sarah Rovito is this wonderful connector within the science policy community who knows everyone. And so she tossed it to me. And one thing that happens is that when something comes in that's connected to a person, you have an extra obligation to read it. So that was one of your first, you didn't know it, but that was one of your first like smooth moves. Generally speaking, I will read everything that comes my way, but sometimes it takes a little while. But this was a little bit express because I had to get back to her. So it's 1,200 words. I just want to tell you what I saw. I did a little bit of analysis of it. So I had to read 400 words before I realized that this op-ed was actually about talent. And then I had to read about 1,100 words before I realized that you were looking, there was one sentence that you were looking to significantly change immigration policy. And that sentence was, one promising starting place would be to expedite the green card exemption for STEM PhD students that was featured in President Biden's US Citizenship Act and replace it with and pair it with a startup visa. So you had the policy ideas were at the very bottom. There was about 500 words devoted to history. So I think what I sent back was, but 2 or 3 things jumped out at me. One was, yeah, visas. This is like a huge subject. I was like, oh my God, yes, visas. And then you also made this like really interesting argument that was right up top. And it wasn't big. You just said you were talking about the Schumer bill and the $100 billion for science. And you said, there's no question that science funding needs significant investment, but funding is only part of the puzzle. So you had this really interesting analysis. You had a totally interesting approach to the next 75 years of science policy, which is a subject that we were exploring and continue to explore. And it was something that wasn't more established players in the science policy field were not pushing this topic at us. Nobody was coming forward with this and saying, oh, we got to reform visas. You kind of almost had to have some experience of what a mess the visa situation was from the inside to understand it. So I think I wrote you a slightly obnoxious letter back that was like, this needs a lot of work. Are you willing to do it? What did you think when you got that?
I thought it came from my advisor. Yeah, I think one thing about being a PhD student is that you appreciate any critical feedback you get on your draft, wherever it comes from. And I'm just glad my advisor did not see it at first, because he would be like, you're gonna need to have like a bunch of writing sessions. That's what he would have said. So I think I was down to put in the work. There was a bit of I had one worry on my head that I wasn't sure, how much work it would require, what would the entire timeline for the whole process would be, because there was this slight concern, okay, what if Endless Frontier Act passes before this is actually published? The whole momentum on Capitol Hill goes, away. What are you going to do then?
Right. So that was a big concern were we going to get the timing right? Caleb, did you have other thoughts and concerns when you got that first response?
Yeah, I mean, I try to hold like the writing of my piece, like in terms of the sentence structure, pretty loosely, because I mean, I submit things to lots of different publications, and every publication has their own different like style, and sometimes the editorial process is very intense and robust, and sometimes it's very loose and light, and so I try not to get very personally attached to the specific sentence structure, and I just care that the ideas that are being conveyed accurately and concisely, and I think definitely that came through in the editorial process at Issue, which was great. I think one concern I had on the bandwidth thing is I was also working on several other projects at the same time. And so just trying to, balance time constraints about, getting this op-ed running. I too was a little bit concerned about just the legislative timeline, as well as balancing these other projects. But it didn't actually end up taking that much work. And I think actually one thing I've noticed about publications that, when you get the first draft back and it's full of red lines, in some sense, that actually means it's less work for you as the author, because a lot of the heavy work for the editing has already been done. And so long as you sort of agree with the vision that's being cast in terms of what the new piece is going to look like, it can sometimes, not be as intense as someone who just gives very vague, make this a little bit fleshed out or something.
So what then? So tell me what the process then looked like to you from there on out. I think we got on a Zoom call and had a quick talk.
Yeah, I think that was useful, just getting sort of a scope of what we wanted to talk about. I mean, one thing I think we were also limited by is a lot of, op-eds, especially in the DC policy scene, are, 8 to 1,200 words. But I knew that Issues sometimes had much longer pieces. And I think the piece through each successive draft ended up becoming much longer and much longer. which is sometimes nice to have the room to let a piece breathe. But it was useful, I think, to have that Zoom call just to get on the same page about where we wanted the piece to go, what sorts of things should be expanded. And I think, as you correctly pointed out, a lot of the meat of the piece was really in fleshing out what are the problems for graduate students who are trying to stay in the US long term, really making that picture clear and spending more time to just flesh out the policy details, which, of course, I was happy to do, given that's basically what I do all day.
Yeah, and I guess one thing I'd add to that is it was also like the feedback that we got from you was important in another way for me, in the sense that like when you're writing about something, you know what you're doing. It's like, what you do when you're writing a paper. If you're not being empathetic to the reviewer, then you're gonna get a lot of editing requests. And I think the first draft, possibly, like, we were writing from the sense that, okay, we know about all these things, but when another person who's not fully aware of what the whole policy debate looks like would have to, as you mentioned, wait for 1100 words to figure out, okay, yeah, this is the problem, this is the solution. And so getting that feedback was very important to figure out, okay, how do we realign this piece for someone who's going to read it and is maybe not fully aware of what the problems are, what the solutions we're proposing would look like.
So this brings up this interesting topic. So first of all, get your questions ready, because we are going to move to questions in about 10 minutes, and we'll continue talking. But I wanted to talk about a little bit about what an op-ed does. Like, an op-ed is basically, and this is how I know I've been talking to the science and technology studies people too long, but an op-ed is a piece of technology that gets expert opinions to policymakers in a super efficient way. And the way that does that is every op-ed is different, but every op-ed has the same parts. I mean, it's like you're building a rocket ship. It's like, it's got the top, it's got the tip, it's got the middle, it's got the ladder section, and then it's kind of got the end. I mean, it's a very conventional structure. And what it always has is it has the first 3 paragraphs have an introduction to the problem, why it's important, and what the policy solution is. But it doesn't have, it's not fleshed out. It's just enough so that this imaginary busy person can go and sort of glance at it and say, oh, I need to read this, or oh, I don't need to read this. So you need to like kind of target that top and sculpt it pretty tightly. And then the next section is broadly, you give a description of the problem and an analysis of the problem that gives some new insights into what's going on. So that, and as an editor, when I look at the analysis, I'm like, oh, are they really delivering something new to this? Are they giving me a new way of looking at an old problem? That's a big deal. And then finally, you get into your policy solution and you explain why it'll work. And boom, that's your op-ed. They're always the same. Like, people try to make them, it's like they try to make like a rocket ship look like a donut or a fork or any number of different things. And I get them, and I always end up sort of remodeling them to this shape. So that's something to keep in mind. And it's also a way of reading op-eds when you read them, is to see, do they do this? Sometimes they break the form, but generally they're kind of like, they do this one thing and they do it really well. And then after you've got that shape, you get into the nitty gritty of developing the argument at issues and at other places I've worked. And just for the general good of the world, I think it's really important to talk to everybody, not just the people who are going to agree with you. So you need your argument to be really strong, really like robust and muscular. You need to assume everybody's smart and everybody's skeptical. And that is the way you sort of cover your bases. And what I thought, as we began to develop your argument, you kept coming back with more and more good stuff. I mean, you had like this really like granular look at the city of Pittsburgh, I think, and how immigrant students coming in turned into sort of local entrepreneurs and created jobs. I mean, you really went down into the weeds and got all of this information and pulled it together. You also we framed the issue in different ways. You framed the issue first as money is not the only thing. Then together we did like another framing of it, of a piecemeal or sort of after the fact approach to immigration reform is not the right way to go. And then there was a sort of a second framing which was to use moral framing. I mean, not just to talk about pragmatics, but also to talk about the moral meaning of this. Like, was it fair to get people to grow our scientific system without giving them some sort of security? And I thought that was really, it went back and forth and back and forth. I don't know how many times we went back and forth. I do want to commend your like stick-to-itiveness, because like at one point you got back a 9-page edit that had just, it's intense track changes and stuff has moved all over the place. But also by this time, when you get back a draft like this, you're looking not only at what needs to be changed for this to make the dumb, efficient rocket ship op-ed shape, but you're also looking at my enthusiasm. So when you get back something covered with marks, it's not a bad sign at all. I mean, it means that you've hooked the editor, basically. I mean, they might be completely exasperated, but they're also they're on the hook. Like, once I've invested that much time, I'm going to help you get it across the line. So tell me what your reaction was, and then we're going to get on to your incredible work getting the word out.
Yeah, I mean, I think like you mentioned, there is sort of like a time investment that you can definitely tell from the editor, which I think is, been through the process enough that I'm not too personally attached when, I am being told to move sections around or reframe things. So I think I sort of really enjoy that process, actually. I enjoy trying to find the best possible version of an argument. I think especially sometimes when you're writing for a different type of audience, you forget which sort of facts are sort of just assumed common wisdom in that community and which ones you really need to refresh. I think another maybe bias that policy people or also academics can have frequently is you're the one who interacts with your own work the most, and you've heard yourself express the same argument 15, 20 times. And so sometimes you don't want to like totally re-articulate it because you think, everyone's already heard that argument before, but oftentimes they haven't. Oftentimes, you're just sort of a little bit tired of the argument, but to everyone else, it's new and fresh. And so finding out new ways of reiterating a lot of that really important context, but in new, fresh ways is really important.
Yeah, I think when I saw that, I was like, oh, wow, I've never actually received like that comprehensive of an edit, except when my advisor and I are editing papers together. I'm like, okay, I really think this is amazing. It's now on us to like put in the effort, like complement all the effort that Lisa's put in to provide all these suggestions. So how can we deliver the best from those, while trying to make sure that the overarching message that we were trying to deliver is there. Yeah.
So then so what happened at the end of that was that we had reformed the top of the essay so that, and people can click on the essay, which is in the chat, but I was just going to bring it up because what happens is, I think we took sort of your initial beginning and we condensed it dramatically to about maybe 30 words. And then we got to the question of funding is only part of the puzzle by about word 50. And then we laid out your policy plan in the next maybe 100, I don't know, maybe 75 words. So by the end of 125 words, we had the phrase, we had these two sentences. Grudgingly accepting the world's best and brightest students, scientists, and entrepreneurs is no longer enough. The United States needs to be actively recruiting them, and legislators need to give them a clear legal path to work here. So boom, we had any person busy enough to need this is also busy, has enough time to just read that top and say, oh yes, this is what I need to read because I understand this. And you have the moral framing is sort of in there as well, that grudgingly giving people access is no longer enough. You have a little panic about it's no longer enough. You're hitting a whole bunch of different emotional things. And so then we published it. And then tell us what happened on your side, how you started getting the word out.
Yeah, I mean, guess I'll kick us off. Both Divyanssh and I have pretty active social media presences, and Twitter is a huge resource for me, both in terms of figuring out what issues to be paying attention to. It's my biggest source of outreach whenever I'm trying to get the news out about a new piece I've written. It's a way of getting critical feedback on ways in which I can improve those ideas going forward. So Twitter is really like the top of the funnel. It's my primary way of getting news out. And over the course of years, I've helped, develop relationships with different Hill staffers, with journalists, with other sorts of policymakers, with other academics, with other policy staffers. And I think, especially in the policy world, Twitter has a really outsized impact. I think a lot of people who aren't necessarily in DC maybe underrate just how many Hill staffers. Twitter is really the primary funnel for them also in terms of information gathering, because it's a way of both filtering out news sources, but also you can find particular sources that you trust over time. I think people have sort of moved away from a brand reputation where before it was like, oh, whatever Brookings or whatever the New York Times puts out, I'm going to listen to that because of the source where it came out. And now in this information abundant environment, people are listening to particular individuals. And so like, oh, I really trust this particular journalist or this particular academic or this particular policy scholar. And so more individualized forms of social media and news consumption are, I think, helping drive that and letting Hill staffers and letting policymakers follow particular people. And so having a really concise thread on Twitter is, it's almost like the whole process of taking a 40-page paper and condensing it into an op-ed, and you almost have to do that whole process again of building a much smaller rocket ship just on Twitter. But trying to find like what's the 280 characters that I can really use to best sum up this argument, get them hooked, and then tell a short thread. And I usually don't recommend going over 10 to 15 tweets max for a thread, because beyond that you start to lose people. But trying to include as many graphs. I think images make those sorts of things much more dynamic. If you can find particular quantitative findings, that really sticks in people's brains a lot more. And I think we did a good job of putting those higher up in the piece in the final version. So we also mentioned those in the thread. And so, yeah, I think social media was at least the tip of the spear for me, especially. And Divyanssh did a bunch of really great outreach on email.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask one question here. Did you have a plan for promoting before the piece was published? Did you have a formal plan, or did you just sort of proceed in your separate normal ways?
I think we had talked, vaguely about what we're going to do. And we just have sort of an open DM chat where we were sort of saying, oh, and then here's who I reached out to this time. And here was the response, and talked about, oh, have you thought about sending it to this person? And so, yeah, we were sort of informally keeping each other updated of how outreach is going, but there wasn't. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And then back to this email.
Like Yellow, I've built a lot of relationships with Hill staff and journalists over the time. So I basically reached out to people I thought, would be very interested in this piece. I asked you first, can we share like a preprint of that with some people who, just keeping it confidential, who would not share it publicly, see what they have to say, get some early feedback as well. And I did that, some committee staff, both science, judiciary, on the House and the Senate side, some of the people who I've come to recognize as my friends more than as colleagues, former Hill staff who are working for various organizations now, just asking them, okay, what do you think about this? We're writing this piece, it's gonna be out hopefully soon. And then, throughout the process of editing the piece, I always kept it in the back of my mind, okay, it would be nice to share it with people once it's out. And one of the ways that was really helpful was when we actually formulated the moral argument. I was like, oh, wait a minute. I remember Senator Kevin Cramer from North Dakota made a moral argument about immigration, in a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing that I don't know why I was attending it, but I was attending it. And he made a comment which was like, okay, that's interesting. Let me flag it to, I have never been in contact with their office before. And I just flagged it for the immigration staffer in their office. And I was like, hey, I remember your boss made a really passionate comment. So I wanted to flag this for you. And then we had cited a bunch of previous work, like it cited the Startup Act that Senator Blunt had introduced previously with Senator Klobuchar, Booker, Moran, Warner. And I was like, okay, I should plug it for them too, that, hey, I know you've been working on this. This might be of interest to you.
Now, can I just say, you were reaching out to staffers, right? Not to the
because like you do not want to. I think at times you don't want to reach out to the politicians themselves, unless like you're best buddies with them, because they have too much on their plate and it's gonna get pushed aside or moved down the ladder. Whereas staff who are specifically handling that portfolio, it's their only job to focus on that issue, and they're already trying to march through all the noise that's coming in, figuring out what's relevant for them to stay up to date on. And this piece, I think, turned out to be very informative, both factually and from a moral making a moral argument over there that I thought people would appreciate, especially people who've been working on this for a long time. So yeah, got a lot of good feedback. Some people flag it for other staffers and other offices. Then I also reached out to a bunch of people who were not specifically working on immigration, but working on the science funding side of things. So I reached out to Senator Schumer's staff who wrote the Endless Frontier Act. I reached out to Senator Young's staff who were working on it. Like previously, we had written an endorsement of the.
Can I ask you a question? How did you find these people's addresses?
Yes. So fortunately, we pay for an annual subscription of Bloomberg Government. But you can just call their offices and ask for the email of whoever's handling a particular issue. There are also other websites like Legistorm where you can get these email addresses, I think. Yeah. So we had actually written an endorsement of the Endless Frontier Act, and I was already in contact with the staff who were working on that. We had written an endorsement of the NSF for the Future Act. Well, actually on the NSF for the Future Act side, we were more involved in the process of the bill, like throughout the process of drafting the bill. We had provided feedback on the draft bill as well. So I was like, okay, I'm going to flag it for the House staffers. I'm going to flag it for the Senate staffers who've been working on these two complementary bills. And they were very appreciative of it, especially in the sense that, not just that it was moving the debate on what's needed for the next 75 years of science policy, but also that we were recognizing that they had been working on this issue as well. Like Chairwoman Eddie Bernice Johnson introduced the Keep STEM Talent Act last year with Representative Bill Foster of Illinois. And the Senate version was from Senator Durbin and now Vice President Kamala Harris. So yeah, there's definitely some interest on the Hill on these issues, and these solutions. I think people appreciate when their efforts are being recognized by the wider public, who are not working on the Hill.
So we have some questions in here. One is, and I'm just going to combine two questions. One is, what would you recommend for people who do not use Twitter? How else can you promote your work? And it seems like email is one. And then another question is, how did you figure out which platforms for promoting your ideas would be the most effective? So you can kind of combine those two. And did you explore other platforms? What about LinkedIn?
Yeah, I don't personally use LinkedIn, but I have colleagues that have used LinkedIn successfully. I think there's like a different demographic or a different kind of set of people that are there, but it definitely can be successful. I see. It's obviously possible to share and promote your pieces without Twitter. I would encourage everyone to get on Twitter. I think especially there are a lot of academic networks. I think it's easier than you think maybe to sort of get started on Twitter. For a lot of people, they think it's like this big fixed cost and it's hard to take that first step. But there's a lot of people in econ Twitter and in epidemiology Twitter and in physics Twitter and different places. And usually there's sort of like an inbuilt community. And if you just announce to people like, hey, I'm new, I've just joined this community, there's sort of like a good faith effort to try to promote your profile and get other people to follow you. So it is like, I think slightly easier than people think to get started on Twitter. And I would recommend it, as it's, especially for policy impact, it is where a lot of the discourse is happening. And I think also connecting it to a point DIVYANSH made earlier, that it's much easier to connect it to the interests and the policy pushes that have previously happened if you've sort of been aware of the conversation. So if you've been following, journalists for a long time, then it's much easier to make a connection and say, hey, I know you were writing about this thing, a couple of months ago. I think this piece really fits within the thesis of what you're trying to say there. And then now they're very invested and interested in sharing or promoting your work. Similarly, if you can, point out to staffers, hey, I know your boss has already been doing a lot of work on this. We're totally on board. Here's, our latest piece that really tries to make the moral case for this. Again, they're going to be much more interested in taking part of that if you can connect it to the broader efforts that have already been happening.
Yeah, and to the point about LinkedIn, like I did not share it on LinkedIn, but I did send it to over email to people who I knew would be interested. So Tracy Silas, who's the acting executive director for academic engagement at the Department of Homeland Security, I sent it to her, and she was like, I'm going to share it on my LinkedIn because apparently her LinkedIn is pretty active. So she shared it on her LinkedIn, which got some traction as well. So I think even if you don't share something on one platform and you're doing a wide reach, it will organically show up somewhere. But definitely going back to Caleb's point, you make a Twitter account. It's where the conversation's happening.
That's really interesting. Do you think, so then let's move on a little bit. How did you manage to get sort of to the next level? What was so this is, you got the word out. You did a couple of really interesting things. You sent things to staffers, said it would be interesting for their bosses. You figured out a really wide variety of staffers. You figured out all these other interesting parties and you contacted them. So you're kind of setting yourself up to go out in a lot of different directions. But then you got it sort of the extra lift up into the congressional record, onto Marketplace. How'd you do that?
Well, I can talk about the Marketplace thing. The Marketplace was sort of funny. I'd been doing a series of other interviews about the Endless Frontier Act more generally, and sort of the case for diversifying science funding in addition to increasing it. And as part of it, as part of several of those interviews, I mentioned, and I have an upcoming piece that's on this immigration angle as well. And there was a lot of interest in that. And so I think sort of another connecting tissue maybe in our broader comments is talk about your work and preview it with people, because that is really how especially the Marketplace interview happened. Was I mentioned this in a previous interview and they were like, oh, we really liked that. We'd like to do a whole 10-minute interview just on that point specifically. And so then that turned into a whole thing. It actually got timed nicely with the release of the issue's article. And so yeah, it all connected pretty well.
I was blown away. I mean, people who are in this space and working for people who've been in this space for a long time don't always time the NPR interview with the appearance of the article. I was like, whoa, this is wild.
There was a bit of coincidence there. It just sort of so happened that it was within the same week. And so then it was like, why not try to pair it together?
Okay, now talk about the congressional record.
Yeah, so I think the biggest part over there was the trust that we built with various congressional officers over the years, right? So if I like to think that if I am sending something to someone, that it's got to meet that bar, for me to send it to someone who's working on the Hill, because they're getting like hundreds of emails or probably thousands every day, and if they're looking out for your email, if they're going to read your email, if they're going to invest that time, it must be worth it. It has to be. So the reputation that we've built as Carnegie Mellon's Graduate Student Assembly on the Hill, working in a nonpartisan manner, with both Republicans and Democrats on the issues, specifically, that's been very helpful. And when I reached out to the Judiciary Committee staff on a different issue, I was like, I actually reached out to them about the consular closures and what can we do about that? Can we reach out to, can we start circulating a letter in Congress about expediting student visa interviews or prioritizing them? Or like, let's get back, I'll push that for, one of the staffers told me that she would push for a hearing on that issue. And I was like, that's actually very helpful. But then a couple weeks later, she sent me that we're having this hearing on how the outdated US immigration system is pushing people off to Canada. So in my first email about the student visa issue, I had flagged our preprint of the piece. She was like, your piece would actually be very useful in that, if we could have it entered into the congressional record. And so I was like, by when do you need it? Because we were not sure at the time, like by when would the piece be published? And she said, here's the time frame. And I was like, okay, well, that's great. Let me inform Lisa right away. And that's when the clock started ticking. And it was basically, I think the biggest ingredient in all of that was the trust that you build over the years advocating for policies and positioning yourself as a credible source of information and input on the Hill. A lot of people, I wouldn't say who's told me this, but a lot of people go on the Hill and they just get into rants when they're advocating about something. They're not being empathetic to the staff who are taking like 20 meetings a day. They're not being helpful in any way in pushing their advocacy. And sometimes they're leveling personal attacks against the members as well, right? And the staff generally do not take that well. So for us, when we do our advocacy, it's very, very, very issue focused. Even if we do not like the member, we're going to take a meeting with them if we can get it. So some of the people I've built really good relationships with, who have left the Hill, really have spoken to that now that they can, like how they've appreciated that. So I think if people who are interested in this space, like building that trust is crucial.
So I want to get to those questions in a second, dig deeper into the bipartisanship and how you create sort of a balanced piece. We've got some interesting questions in the chat, but just before we move on to that, so one question we have from an attendee is, post-publication, are there things that the staff at Issues could have done to enhance your outreach efforts on this piece? I don't know if this is some sort of internal mole. Who's asking this? But anyway, this is a question that has been submitted in the chat, and I'm curious.
I mean, I was appreciative of, I think you guys helped make an infographic based on some of the graphs or some of the stats that we cited in the piece, which, as I mentioned earlier, is another way of getting engagement on Twitter. So that was, very helpful, very useful, and unusual for, I think, an outlet to be publishing. So that was useful. It's sort of hard, I think, in some sense. Institutional accounts on Twitter are just sort of inherently limited. Like, as I mentioned, people like engaging with individuals, not with like brands or institutions. And so there's just like some inherent limit, I think, for institutional accounts to be promoting stuff. But maybe I would recommend the Issues in Science and Technology staff should get very active on Twitter, and then you guys can help promote things there. But
so as individuals. So what's helpful then is individuals promoting things, because that has more credibility than the issue. But what's interesting then, though, is that the article being published in Issues also gives it a different weight with the policymaker. So you kind of have to balance the institutional authority and the individual excitingness on Twitter, which is an interesting thing. Another person asks, that says both of you are really sophisticated in terms of existing relationships and social media. What advice do you have for people who have less experience or have not developed relationships to get their piece out?
Yeah, I think I would say a few things. One is it's never too early to start developing relationships. And if you have valuable, interesting, thoughtful advice or feedback on things, like that's the perfect time to reach out to someone and start developing those relationships. I think one thing I would say is there's a fine line between like reaching out to people and starting to develop relationships and not like spamming them. Because this is the thing I see some analysts fall into where they get very excited about feedback on a piece or something. And then, you give them some feedback and then suddenly they're spamming you with every single piece they're writing. And so recognizing sort of the push and pull of targeting and treating your relationships as like something to be respected. In some sense, it's a scarce resource, their attention. And so making sure the things you're sharing with them are targeted and really, in their interest. But you can also do a lot of cold outreach, I think, if you can identify like who are the 10, 15 people that really matter on this. And so in terms of Hill staffers specifically, I think a really simple technique that's under leveraged is just find out like, okay, what's the relevant committee that matters most for this issue, go through the committee page, see who the ranking members are, and then look through their staff pages, find out who the relevant staffer who's covering that issue for that member on the committee is, and then try to see what has the member done before on the past. And again, if you can make that connection between here's something that the member, your boss has already been working on, has already expressed and shown interest in, and here's a way in which I can connect now my work to that. It's just you're going to get a much higher hit rate.
That's really interesting.
And
empathy you mentioned also.
Yes, and other than that, like one thing I would really say, like if you are reaching out to someone, I really appreciate when people reach out to me, like if they are sending me a cold email and they need some help. I appreciate that, but I appreciate it even more when they end with, if there's anything I can be a resource of you, if there's anything I can help you with, please let me know. And I think that the same thing goes with staffers as well. Like you have to build that long-lasting relationship, and staff turnover is pretty high. They might move to another office. They might move to the executive branch. So that person-to-person relationship will still stay. And if you've actually, not just been spamming them with all the stuff you need, but also offering yourself as, if you need any feedback, any constituent feedback, or any feedback of, someone who's working in this space, who's, I say like, if you want a graduate student perspective, or if you want, a perspective of someone who's doing research in AI, then please let me know. I'm happy to help. And people have taken me up on that offer. People will. So I recommend doing that. That'll be very useful in building those relationships.
This is great. We have the beginnings of a campaign here. How to sit down and set one up. So I want to just sort of back up. We've got some really interesting questions. One person says, how do you strike a balance between having a clear point of view and being overly partisan? Have you worked on any pieces that straddle that line well? Do you have thoughts? I know I have thoughts, but I'd like to hear yours first.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there are, of course, going to be some issues where there is inherently like a partisan valence. But I think taking the attitude that you, Lisa, mentioned earlier of trying to think like, what is a smart, sophisticated, skeptical reader going to be thinking as they're reading this, and trying to be proactive about identifying where those weak points in your arguments are, and maybe being sympathetic to those in some sense, and trying to proactively answer them, I think goes a long way. Also, acknowledging trade-offs, I think, is very important. If everything is just, blue sky, there's no possible reason why your exact policy intervention has never been done before. That makes it seem like I guess, yeah, less reality-based, less like you're actually trying to be a thoughtful, considerate analyst in this area, and more that you're an evangelist for one thing or another.
Right. I actually did write a very partisan-leaning piece once because I thought that was needed at the time. It also, like, I would still say that you are free to write that, if you want to. Just be aware of who to flag it to. But honestly, I found that nonpartisan advocacy has been more successful for us than any partisan advocacy has been. Which is why I try to avoid taking any partisan stances. Though at the same time, I would say if you're criticizing one person or a person's policies, it's also true that there are people in their own party who are also criticizing the same policies. When we were criticizing President Trump's OPT, proposal to suspend OPT, 22 Republican members of Congress also wrote to him asking that he do not suspend OPT, right? Including some people who were in contention to be NRCC chair, the National Republican Congressional Committee chair. So there are people who will be people who are sharing those views, who are also trying to navigate the same situation, because at the end of the day they are in the same party. So thinking it from their perspective, like how would you write the same thing if you were say if you are trying to have a partisan lean that's maybe anti-Trump or something? How would you write the same thing if you were a Republican? How would you navigate that? And recognizing the good things that have happened, and criticize, offering constructive solutions to things that you oppose.
So I'm going to offer two. I think you both have laid out like very thoughtful approaches to this. I'm going to give you two other things. One is like very specific to your piece. Your piece originally had a lot of things about President Trump's movements against on visas and some of the decisions and how they were bad. And what we did was we actually took most of those out, because the argument was, as we went back and forth, actually this had happened in other administrations. It wasn't unique to the Trump administration. The problem was that the rights are not assured. They are not actually a right. They are free to be taken away by anybody, and they sort of go in the winds. H-1B visas go up and down according to kind of who knows what. I mean, anxieties, free-floating anxieties among people, and sort of political movements. And so that it was saying, it was actually taking that and kind of stepping back and putting it in the framing of the piece, was saying the fact that these are not guaranteed, the fact that we expect something of people and don't give them something in return, like a clear visa status or one type of visa instead of 4 types of visas. This is wrong. So we actually put that in the framing so that it became less partisan and became much more generalized, and also became part of the moral framing. So that's one thing. And then another thing is, I would say, is just always assume that you don't know who you're arguing to. It's one of the things that's happened as the country has become more partisan, is that people have an idea of what they think people like them think. But in fact, you actually don't know what they think. We don't know what each other thinks. We know what they say on Twitter. We know certain things, and we have certain ideas or packages of this kind of thinking or that kind of thinking. But if you really want to convince people, you actually need to meet everybody where they are. And that means doing like a really good, really careful argument that's going to convert the skeptics. There's another question that's, I think, really interesting, and I want to get you to weigh in, and then we're going to move to the end here. So it says, what if you're not naturally an emotional writer and your background is rationally making a case, for example, science? Like, it would be hard for me to say, this is the questioner, to say that the US needs more entrepreneurs of any kind. I would be thinking, what kind of evidence supports that claim? So how do you get over the voices in your head, the reluctance to step outside the comfort zone in your argument? Do you have some sort of final thoughts on that?
I think I am also naturally not like a particularly emotional writer. I mean, I think the nice thing about writing is that you can have multiple iterations. And so if what you feel most comfortable with is sort of the more analytical, here's the solid evidence for everything, write that draft first, and then you can try to, in future iterations, include more of an emotional, moral argument to things. But if you also feel like if you feel the evidence base for your argument is very sound and very solid, and you feel like you firmly established that in the piece in previous iterations, I think it's then much easier to add that sort of emotional, moral valence on on a future layer. But I don't know, it's a tough balance to walk, and it's also not like something that I'm a natural at.
Yeah, same. I would say the same. Like my like when I'm writing, primarily when I'm writing, I'm conveying findings from a bunch of experiments, right? That's my default position. And so when I'm writing for non-research topics, or on various issues, it can sometimes be very to the point, very factual, very evidence-based, like lacking that emotion that might sometimes be needed. And as Caleb said, like you iterate over it, you see like, how do I make it more persuasive? Who is my reader? Identifying that and tailoring your essay over and over is a very good exercise to enable that.
Do you find that when you write the essay, by the time you're done with the editing process, you've convinced yourself? I find that sort of a process that goes on with writing, is that as you layer up more and more reasons and analysis and framing and thinking about it, that part of the process convinces you.
I think that's right. I think it's also helpful to, I mean, I'll sometimes do multiple readovers where I'm trying to like imagine reading it from just different perspectives and like where would be the weak points in the argument from those things. And so I think that also helps too, that once I feel very like solid about the evidence base for an argument, or that I feel like the quantitative case is very strong, then I feel very comfortable adding more moral or emotional valence. But like I don't quite feel comfortable adding that until I feel like the other stuff is there.
Yeah, I think one thing to do is to consider just starting to write and seeing where you end up. I know when I first started writing op-eds, I just thought they were the weirdest thing. I was writing on gasoline. I'd spent 4 years following gasoline around, but the procedure of writing an op-ed and telling people what to think about gasoline, I thought it was the weirdest thing. But once you realize that the op-ed is doing a particular job, it's bringing expertise to policy, it does it in this particularly efficient way. Once you embrace the op-ed as a technology and not as feelings, I think it becomes a different thing, and then you can use it in this really transformative way, and which you both did. And I thank you so much for joining us this afternoon and for sharing your knowledge and your incredible techniques for getting this out there, and also your wisdom in creating the piece. Thank you very much, and I want to thank the audience as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks, Divyansh and Caleb. This was super interesting. I hope that everybody with a good policy idea in our audience has been taking careful notes. And of course, you should pitch your idea to us at Issues. If it currently looks like a donut or a fork, we'll help you turn it into a rocket ship. If you like conversations like this, you've come to the right place. I really encourage you all to go visit our site at issues.org. You can read a lot of pieces like Caleb and Divyansh's. You can also see what's coming up. We've got a lot of great events planned for the fall. We hope you'll join us there. You can also subscribe to our beautiful print magazine, our quarterly journal. The next issue will be out in October. And finally, we have a free weekly newsletter that I'd encourage you to sign up for, just to keep track of all the great events and articles that we're that we're working on. So thank you again, all of you, for joining us. Thank you, Caleb and Divyansh and Lisa for moderating. We will see you next time. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.